Hello and a warm welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us tomorrow. We're joined by Sonia Sodha, who's the chief leader writer for The Observer, and also Olivia Utley, the deputy leader writer at The Sun. Lovely to see you both. Right, let's start with tomorrow's front pages. We're going to kick off with the Metro, which is focusing on Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer's criticism of delays to the rollout of a national track and trace service in England, which has been pushed back from May to the winter. Onto the China Daily, which is reporting on the start of a phase 3 of a coronavirus vaccine trial in the United Arab Emirates, in what it says is the first vaccine to reach a large-scale human trial. Now, meanwhile, the Express lays out the UK Prime Minister's plans to kickstart Britain's economy and to modernise the country. The Eye is leading on the controversy surrounding the UK's Housing Minister, Robert Genrich, who is accused of fast-tracking approval for a housing development before new legislation took effect. The UK edition of the Financial Times looks at the hottest day of the year here and says that many people appear to disregard social distancing as they rush to beaches and to beauty spots, including Bournemouth, which is the image there. And finally, the Arab News features warnings from the IMF in its World Economic Outlook after it's said that the global economic impact of coronavirus would be significantly worse than thought at first. So let's begin with our guests. Thank you so much for joining us, as always. We're going to start with the China Daily because the paper is describing the vaccine entering a phase 3 of its trial. Of course, we're all really hopeful of a vaccine to come into fruition, where it's crucial in terms of unlocking. When it comes to what the China Daily is describing, this third phase, Sonia, where are we at with this?
So it's the third phase of a clinical trial of a vaccine that the Chinese government has been funding. It's actually happening in the United Arab Emirates. So it's sort of a bit further down the line than many of the vaccine trials we're seeing around the world. And really this is reflective of the fact that countries around the world are in a race to develop a vaccine. And we've got lots, multiple different efforts by different drugs companies, backed by different governments. Everyone is trying to be the first that gets there, which is a good thing because with vaccine development, you can't put all your eggs in one basket. There's no guarantee that one particular vaccine trial is going to work. So the more trials we've got going on, the better, particularly given the fact that normally, it might take a decade to develop a vaccine against something like coronavirus, particularly if we were talking 5 or 6 years ago. And we've seen a massive acceleration in vaccine development. That said, and it is good news that this drug is, in its third phase of its clinical trial. We've got a couple of trials going on over here in the UK as well now underway that scientists are optimistic, they're keeping their fingers crossed about, but even bearing that in mind, it's still going to be, scientists think a vaccine that's still at least another year away, which is a long time. So, it is the ultimate exit strategy from a coronavirus lockdown. If you've got a vaccine, if you can distribute it around the world, it means people aren't at such great risk, but it's still a long way off.
Yes, it's still a long way off. Yes, thank you for just underlining that, Sonia. Olivia, when it comes to the UK, human trials have begun in London of a new vaccine, and if this is successful, it could yield enough doses to immunise 40 million people in Britain by the middle of next year. But of course, as Sonia, just a caveat, as Sonia was saying, it's all very complicated and very difficult, but a little bit of hope also in these human trials starting in the UK.
Yeah, just a lot of ifs and a lot of buts. And I think UK scientists are very, very keen to make clear all the time that vaccines, it's very much a case of trial and error. And there are going to be a lot of mistakes before we reach the right vaccine. I think the Chinese government is obviously quite keen to play up what they're doing, which is it's brilliant news, and we shouldn't dumb that down. But on the other hand, I think our scientists, perhaps they're more cautious. There's sort of what they want to they want to dampen expectations a little bit, and that's probably the right approach with something like a vaccine, which the only way you can develop the right one is by getting it wrong lots and lots of times.
And Sonia, in terms of who owns the rights to these, of course, there are numerous different organisations trying to move forward with these. If we get a successful vaccine, who owns the rights? How is it shared up? Of course, we saw different countries competing for PPE stock. Are we going to see the same when it comes to hopefully a successful vaccine?
Well, the answer is it completely depends, and it depends who gets there first. A lot of people, for example, like Gordon Brown, our former Prime Minister, have pointed to the fact that when it came to Ebola, a lot of money was invested through an organisation, a scheme called Gavi, which is essentially making sure that whoever owned the rights to the vaccine, there were commitments there in order to get it out to people who need it the most and the countries that need it the most, the frontline healthcare workers that need it the most. Now, that was slightly easier to coordinate because Ebola had a relatively limited geographical impact compared to coronavirus, which is a truly global pandemic. And I know lots of politicians have expressed, and particularly lots of internationalist politicians have expressed concern that there don't seem to be those systems being developed. We need real international cooperation to ensure that that's the case. And at the end of the day, that's in everyone's interest, because really we want the vaccine, there may be limited doses available at first, and you want it to be prioritised for countries that need it the most, countries without sort of sustainable healthcare systems, and also for the frontline healthcare workers and the at-risk age groups that need it the most. So, if you're a 20-year-old living in the UK, you're really not at high risk from coronavirus, whereas, if you're 80-year-old living in the UK, you are, and maybe in some other lower income countries, you may be more at risk as well because health systems are just less able to cope. So I think there's huge concern around making sure that there is equitable global access to a vaccine, but those systems just don't seem to be in place yet with this coronavirus vaccine.
And something that doesn't also seem to be in place, the Metro talking about the track and trace app, the headline saying the Prime Minister referring to Boris Johnson making it app as he goes along, a bit of a pun on words there. But Olivia, this is something that we'd been promised, and during a rather testy PMQs, Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, suggesting the Prime Minister Boris Johnson is not across his facts when it comes to the track and tracing app that, in theory, is being developed in the UK.
Yeah, the whole track and trace thing sort of makes you want to tear your hair out, because as Boris Johnson said in Prime Minister's Questions, which is a fair enough point, he was making it very clear that it's very, very difficult to set up this app from scratch and getting it rolled out across the country. But why then did he not say that at the beginning? Why was he saying that we'll have a world-beating app in the middle of May when it obviously just wasn't at all sure that we were going to? And now, again, expectations were raised too high, and now he looks silly. I also have had a few questions over why were these two, 12 million, okay, that's a lot to develop an app, but considering the whole cost of lockdown, it's a drop in the ocean. So why weren't these two separate app programs, the sort of NHS one and the Apple and Google one, being funded and paid for together to see which one works out? It just seems like there are just a lot of questions over why this hasn't. Why hasn't the communications been handled better, apart from anything else? But also, why weren't they taking? Why were they putting all their eggs in one basket with this NHS one?
And Sonia, the paper especially sort of focusing on this idea that the Prime Minister, well, he said that there was no country in the world had a functioning app. Sir Keir Starmer said that actually Germany has, with 12 million downloads.
And I think if you look at other countries like Singapore, South Korea, they've got a functioning app. Now, their apps aren't perfect. And if you speak to countries that have been the most successful so far in kind of shutting down the first wave of the pandemic, people from Singapore, they say an app can never replace human contact tracing, but it's complementary to it. And I think Olivia's absolutely right about the app itself. But what's even more worrying about the contact tracing scheme is the government seemed to think that the app was going to do it all for it. Now, experts have always said, human contact tracing, where you've got people talking to people on the phone who've been tested positive for COVID, working out who they've come into contact with. It's quite a high-skilled job. The government has not invested in that. We've got most of that being done by low-paid call centre handlers who've had barely any training. And that's one of the things that Keir Starmer was pointing at in PMQs today. According to Labour's figures, only around a third of those estimated to have got COVID-19 at the moment have been contacted by this scheme, have been contacted by contact tracers and asked to supply the contact details of people that they've been in contact with. Now, a third just isn't good enough. A third isn't enough to prevent local outbreaks. It's not enough to track what's going on. And that's what's really kind of worrying experts, because we're seeing a huge relaxation of restrictions, social distancing restrictions at the moment. And what scientists really wanted to be in place to being comfortable with that was a proper track and trace scheme up and running now. And the government's had weeks to prepare for it. Sure, it's a difficult thing to do, but it's had weeks to prepare for it. It seems to have wasted some of those weeks. It hasn't learned the lessons in its big logistical failures in the past, like on personal protective equipment, like on testing. And so it feels like we're going into a relaxation of the lockdown, and we haven't got the scheme in place that's absolutely critical to prevent outbreaks and a second wave happening.
And the second wave, actually, that leads us on nicely onto the front page of the Financial Times. Everybody in the UK will have noticed that it was rather hot today, record temperatures, and that, of course, encourages people to get outside, get onto the beaches. This image is actually from Bournemouth Beach, and well, you can see, we're still meant to be social distancing, Olivia, and a lot of concern over images like this and what this could potentially do with a resurgence of the virus and also potentially a second wave of the virus.
Yes, although I do actually get a little bit tired of shaming people who are out in beaches and beauty spots. There is a lot of evidence that coronavirus doesn't transmit particularly effectively outside. There was a study in China, 2,000 cases transmitted, only one of them was transmitted outside. So the fact that people are gathering outside rather than inside is surely a good thing. And if you forbid people from meeting up inside, forbid them from doing pretty much anything, then of course they're going to be doing the few things that they are allowed to do, which includes sitting on the beach. Yes, of course, they should be social distancing, and let's hope that this won't cause a huge spike. But so far, the sort of mass gatherings outside haven't caused a spike. So slightly tiresome, sort of shaming all these people who are desperately trying to entertain very bored children who've been off school for months and months, and their parents just want some time at the beach with them. You know, can't really blame them for it. And let's see. I mean, personally, I don't think that this is going to cause a massive spike. If the Black Lives Matter protest didn't a few weeks ago, then why would some people chilling on the beach?
Well, there's certainly, with this easing of lockdown restrictions, Sonia, you've got this the sides that if you're inside gyms, for example, things like that, these restrictions, they're not allowed to open just yet. And a lot of angst about when these businesses will be able to open finally, compared to, say, the pubs, also pubs with open gardens, etc., that they can.
Yeah, it sounds like gyms are very disappointed. I got an email from my gym telling me how disappointed they were that they couldn't open on the 4th of July. But to me, it makes complete sense. I mean, if anything, I think the government has gone for too rushed a relaxation, too many measures all at the same time. I would have preferred to see it take a more cautious approach, doing it in a more staged way, which would have enabled the government to track which relaxations may be associated with a spike. At the moment, it feels like the government's just sort of thrown the kitchen sink at it a bit. It doesn't surprise me that gyms aren't allowed to open. You know, to me, sort of the idea of being in a sweaty spin studio, that just doesn't. I'm not a scientist, but that doesn't kind of feel appropriate, given that there is a global pandemic on. So it's not a surprise to me. But I think we do really need to ask ourselves tough questions about prioritisation. So it really bothers me that non-essential retail has been open for a week and a half now, that pubs are going to be reopening, and yet the vast majority of children are still not back at school. And for me, schools should have been the absolute #1 priority, above queues at Primark, above pubs reopening. And it really, to me, says something a bit worrying about us as a country, that we're able to prioritise clothes shopping over children being back at school.
Well, a lot of discussion about the social distancing measures within schools, but we're going to just leave coronavirus for the time being and have a look at the newspaper, which is referring to the Housing Secretary, Robert Genrich, who has today released documents relating to his approval of a development in East London involving a Conservative Party donor, Olivia.
Yes, I think this story just isn't going away, and I think the government hoped for a long time that it would just be forgotten amid the coronavirus news, but it's not. It feels like a sort of cash for favours, but we don't know all the details, obviously. But that's the sort of feel of the scandal, and Boris has dug his heels in again and is backing Genrich to the hilt. I think on the front of the eye, a spokesman said that the Prime Minister considers the matter closed, exactly what he did with Cummings. And I think it's the same sort of problem. There was an interesting story in the Times today, another Genrich story, all about this. What has Genrich been doing on the side? One thing was that he got refused for planning permission on his own house twice, then got elected as a Conservative MP, sent in the planning application again under his wife's name, and hey presto, it got accepted. And I think that's sort of one thing for them, another thing for the rest of us. Narrative really doesn't go down well with the public at all. And I think it's quite surprising that Genrich himself hasn't resigned already, just so as, even he might be completely innocent of everything, but just he has become the story now in exactly the same way Cummings did. And surely it would be good for him and his government and his party if he stepped aside. And I wonder if those are the conversations going on in Downing Street now, or if Boris Johnson really thinks that he can just back Genrich and hope that it all melts away.
Well, we're not privy to those conversations behind closed doors, but the Prime Minister has said that he considers the matter is closed. He said that Mr Genrich has set out a full and factual account voluntarily, Sonia, and that Mr Genrich has dismissed any suggestions that his decision was biased as being outrageous.
Yeah, I think it's very surprising that Genrich hasn't resigned on one level. I think if we'd been talking about the story 10 years ago, if it had been a cabinet minister in this position with the papers showing a sequencing of events that they did, it would have looked very incriminating. I mean, Genrich himself had to reverse his decision. He admitted that it looks biased, even if it wasn't. I think there will be lots of people who think that, who will speculate that it could have been biased. And, I think 10 years ago, that would have been his ministerial career over for now, and he would have had to go. But of course, we're living in really strange times where a government senior advisor like Dominic Cummings can actually flout the rules of the lockdown and still not get away with it. So I suspect Boris Johnson will regard, if Genrich goes now, he will regard it as sort of a sign of it being perceived as a sign of weakness. So I expect this message that we've got from Downing Street today will continue, and I expect Johnson will continue to back him. I might be proved wrong. But the thing to be aware of is that there is talk of a cabinet reshuffle coming down the track in a sort of few weeks' time over the summer. And I don't think anyone's expecting necessarily Genrich to stay in his position then. But I think that the Prime Minister, in normal times, he would have had to go. I think the story is incriminating enough. But I think the Prime Minister, Johnson, he wants to sort of feel like he'll let him go in his own time rather than be forced into it by the emerging details of this scandal.
Well, just to stress that Mr Genrich had released a letter in which he'd sent to MPs, and he'd said after his reappointment, in which he said that he'd met Mr Desmond for dinner and he told him that he could not discuss this issue. So just to put that across. Moving on to a Polish newspaper, to Wyborcza. It's looking at Poland's President Andrzej Duda at the White House with talks with President Trump, and this is all happening just days before the presidential election in Poland. So quite a lot of consternation in Poland about the timing of this, Olivia.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that it's so odd having a leader of the United States who's such a toxic presence that sort of collaborating with him before an election is seen as very damning to whoever's running. I just remember over here when Trump was coming to the UK, and it was just an absolute political minefield for Boris Johnson deciding whether or not to see Trump, how not to be rude, but also not to turn Liberals in the UK against Boris because he was too friendly with Trump. So it seems to be the same sort of thing happening in Poland, but I'm sure you're far more clued up about it than I am.
There's got quite a lot of concern about the timing and whether this will impact the election. Just finally, the Arab news, because we saw that as a photo opportunity, another photo opportunity here in Moscow, the Russian Victory Day parade. The image is actually of Russian service women marching during Wednesday's Victory Day parade, while there is a high level of pandemic in Russia, Sonia.
Yes, so these celebrations were delayed from early May. A lot of people are quite suspicious of the timing. So there was a very important constitutional vote in Russia next week, which would essentially, give Putin the power to sort of install himself to stand for election, in inverted commas, even after his term expires in 2024. So it's sort of, another step into sort of taking Russia into that sort of dictatorship territory, I suppose you could call it that. So he's trying to sort of whip up a sense of patriotism ahead of that, and he's not expected to lose it. So people are quite concerned that this parade went ahead, and there were some precautions taken. I think veterans at the parade had to sort of quarantine in a sanatorium outside Moscow for 14 days, but still it's thought that there's significant potential for coronavirus to spread. And this is really in Putin's political interests, not in the health interests of Russia. And Moscow also saw a big relaxation in its lockdown 2 weeks ago, which Russian scientists think was too early.
And in fact, there was meant to be bigger celebrations for this. For the time being, Sonia, Olivia, thank you so much. We'll see you back for the next edition of Papers. #BBC Papers if you'd like to get involved in the conversation. Thanks for joining us.